Rough night out there, isn't it? Come in, come in. Don't just stand in the doorway. You'll let the cold in. Here, sit by the fire. There's a stool right there, next to the hearth. Let me pour you something warm. Forgive my manners. Name's Barnaby. Barnaby Thatcher, though most folk just call me Barnaby. I'm the keeper of this establishment, the Golden Flagon. See that sign swinging outside? Been running this place for, must be 15 years now. Feels like a lifetime. Before that, I was a different man entirely. I spent my youth as a soldier. A hired sword, if you want the plain truth of it. Fought in France, in Burgundy, in places whose names I can barely pronounce anymore. Saw half of Europe from the back of a horse, or from the mud of a battlefield, more often than not. Got this bad leg at Agincourt. Nasty business, that battle. You've probably heard of it, King Henry's great victory, they call it now. Songs and poems and all that. But I was there in the mud with the common soldiers, and I can tell you it wasn't glorious. It was chaos. Arrows falling like rain, horses screaming, men drowning in their own armor. I took an arrow through the thigh early on, kept fighting on it for hours until a destroyer, that's a warhorse, massive thing, fell sideways during a cavalry charge and pinned my leg beneath it. 3 men had to drag me out from under that beast. By the time they did, I knew my soldiering days were finished. Couldn't march after that. Couldn't fight. Couldn't do much of anything a soldier's supposed to do. The company paid me out, not much, but more than some got, and I limped back to Paris. Spent a year doing odd jobs, getting by. Then I heard about this place. An old widow named Marguerite. She'd been running it for 30 years, but her arthritis had gotten so bad she couldn't lift the ale barrels anymore. She wanted to retire, go live with her daughter in Lyon. I took everything I'd saved, the payout, what I'd won at dice, even sold my armor and sword, and I bought the Golden Flagon from her. Best decision I ever made, truth be told. A warm fire beats a cold tent any day of the week, and the work suits me. Standing behind a bar, you don't need 2 good legs. You just need good ears and a steady hand for pouring. Now I stand behind this bar, and the world comes to me. Merchants carrying silk from the east, spices from places I've never seen, pilgrims on their way to Canterbury or Compostela, covered in dust, their feet wrapped in bloody rags, but their eyes full of faith. Knights with their squires, talking loud about tourneys and honour. Beggars with nothing but the rags on their backs, hoping someone will buy them a crust of bread. Minstrels, monks, peddlers, prostitutes, everyone passes through a tavern eventually. They all need the same things: a drink, a fire, maybe a bed if they can afford it, and someone to listen. And everyone has a story. I've heard thousands by now. Tales of war and love, of fortunes won and lost overnight, of miracles and curses, of saints and demons. Some stories I forget as soon as the teller walks out the door, but others stay with you. They burrow into your mind, and they won't leave. You find yourself thinking about them years later, wondering if they really happened the way you heard them, or if time has twisted them into something stranger. Did I ever tell you about the time I witnessed a pig standing trial for murder? Aye, you heard me right. A pig. Not metaphorically an actual pig, 4 legs and a snout and all. Standing in a courtroom. Well, standing in a pen in a courtroom, but you take my meaning. There was a judge in red robes, a jury of 12 good men, lawyers arguing back and forth with all the seriousness of a treason trial. And at the end of it all, that pig was found guilty, sentenced to death, dressed in human clothes, a waistcoat and breeches, I swear on my mother's grave, and hanged in the town square while half the town watched. Pour yourself another drink, friend. This story is longer than you'd think, and it gets stranger with every detail. The night's young, yet or old, depending on how you look at it, and the storm outside isn't going anywhere. Might as well settle in. I'll tell it properly, from the beginning. It was the autumn of 1386. I was still a young man then, maybe 22, 23 years old. Hard to remember exactly, we didn't keep track of birthdays the way you might think. Fresh from a campaign down in Gascony, my company was marching north through Normandy, heading back toward Paris where we'd been hired for garrison duty over the winter. We were all looking forward to it, warm barracks, regular meals, wine instead of stream water, and most importantly, no fighting. Garrison duty was boring, aye, but boring meant you probably wouldn't die. We stopped for a few days in a town called Falaise. You might know it, William the Conqueror was born there, in the castle on the hill. Pretty little place, or it seemed so at first. Good stone walls, streets that weren't entirely mud, a proper market square. The kind of town that looked prosperous and peaceful, at least from a distance. We'd been sleeping rough for weeks, so even a few nights in a real town with real beds felt like luxury. But walk those streets for an hour, and you'd see what medieval towns really were. Not the romantic picture they paint in songs and stories. The reality was mud everywhere. Thick, stinking mud mixed with God knows what. Animal dung, human waste thrown from chamber pots, rotting vegetables, dead rats, all of it churned together by cartwheels and boots, and hooves until the streets were like a thick soup. You'd sink in up to your ankles if you weren't careful. The smell, well, you never truly get used to it, though you stop noticing after a while. Your nose just gives up, I think. Pigs wandering loose in the alleys, rooting through garbage piles, chickens pecking at doorsteps, fighting with rats over scraps. Dogs everywhere, strays mostly, half-wild things, thin as skeletons, goats tied to posts, the occasional cow being led to market, and children, barefoot children, playing in the same streets, splashing in the same mud. Nobody thought anything of it. That was just how things were. You see, back then, pigs weren't kept in pens the way they are now. Well, rich folk kept them penned, aye, But common people couldn't afford that. They'd let their pigs roam free during the day. The pigs were their garbage collectors, see? Ate everything humans threw out. Food scraps, rotten vegetables, even human waste if there was nothing else. It was practical in a way. You didn't have to feed the pig, and the pig kept the streets a bit cleaner. Not much cleaner, mind you, but a bit. Come evening, the pigs would usually come home on their own. They knew where they were fed, and when winter came and food got scarce, you'd slaughter the pig and have meat for weeks. But it also meant you shared the streets with hundreds of animals that were half domestic, half wild. They were always hungry, always rooting around for food. Most of them were harmless enough. But sometimes things went wrong. It was an autumn morning. Third day we'd been in Falaise, if memory serves. I remember because the air had that particular crisp bite to it that you only get in October. The leaves on the trees were turning gold and brown, and there was frost on the ground when you woke up, though it melted by mid-morning. Beautiful, really, if you stopped to look at it. Not that soldiers stopped to look at much. We were too busy enjoying not being on the road. I was in the tavern where we'd been staying. Different tavern, different life. Nursing a cup of weak ale and a sore head from the night before. We'd been celebrating, see, because we'd gotten paid. Actual coin, for once. Not promises or IOUs. So naturally we'd spent half of it on wine and dice games. I'd lost most of my pay to a bastard from Picardy who I'm still convinced was using loaded dice, and I was sitting there in the morning, regretting my life choices and wondering if I had enough left to buy breakfast. The tavern was half full. Morning drinkers, mostly. You'd be surprised how many people start drinking at dawn. Farmers who'd already been up for hours. Night watchmen coming off duty. A few fellow soldiers from my company. The tavern keeper's wife was bringing out bread and cheese, slamming it down on tables with the kind of anger that suggested her husband had done something to annoy her. Normal morning. Peaceful, even. Then we heard it. A scream. Not the kind of scream you hear in battle. That's different. That's anger and fear and rage all mixed together. A man's scream as he charges or falls. This was a woman's scream. A mother's scream. High and sharp and absolutely broken. The kind of sound that goes straight through you like a knife. The whole tavern went quiet. Everyone froze, cups halfway to lips, conversations stopping mid-word. Then we heard it again. And again, over and over, not stopping. Just this endless wail of grief so deep and primal that you just knew something terrible had happened. Half the tavern emptied in seconds. Old soldier's instinct. I suppose you hear someone screaming like that, you run toward it. Not because you're brave, but because it's what you're trained to do. I was up and out the door with the rest of them. Ale forgotten, hangover forgotten. We ran through those muddy streets following the sound, and we weren't the only ones. People were pouring out of houses, out of shops, all running in the same direction. We found ourselves outside a small house near the tanner's quarter. I remember that because the smell of tanning leather was strong in that part of town, mixing with all the other smells. It was a poor house, just 2 rooms probably, walls of wattle and daub that needed repair, a thatched roof with holes in it. The door was broken, hanging off its leather hinges like something had forced its way through. Not broken from outside though, broken from inside, pushed outward. That should have been our first clue, but we didn't notice it at the time. Inside, there was chaos. The mother, Marie was her name, Marie Cormier. I heard it said a dozen times that day she was collapsed on the floor, halfway into the room, wailing, just wailing, over and over. No words anymore, just sound. Her husband, Jean, was there, and 3 or 4 other men, and they had a rope around a pig. A big sow, maybe 200 pounds, fighting them with everything she had. Squealing and thrashing and trying to bite, she was covered in, well, there's no delicate way to say this. She was covered in blood, fresh blood, dripping from her snout, splattered on her shoulders and back. The room was destroyed. The cradle, there'd been a wooden cradle near the hearth. It was overturned, broken. The blankets were scattered. There was blood on the floor, on the walls, and in the corner, covered with a cloak someone had thrown over it. I won't describe what we found. Some things a soldier learns not to speak of. Not because of the horror I'd seen horror enough in war, but because some things are too sad, too senseless. The child's name was Jahan, little Jahan Cormier, 3 years old. The mother had left him sleeping for just a moment. She'd gone to fetch water from the well, not 50 paces away. 5 minutes? Maybe less. That's all it took. The men dragged the sow out into the street. By now there must have been 50 people gathered, maybe more. Some of the women went to Marie, tried to comfort her, though how do you comfort that? Some of the men wanted to kill the pig right there. I saw one man with a club, another with a knife. There was talk of burning it. Someone shouted that they should burn the beast alive for what it had done. The mob was getting angry, working itself up. That's how these things go. Tragedy turns to rage, and rage needs somewhere to go. But then the town bailiff arrived. The bailiff's name was Robert de Logres. I remember because he came to the tavern later to question witnesses, and I had to give testimony. He was a thin man, maybe 40 years old, with a grey beard, and the kind of face that looked like it had never smiled. He wore a leather jerkin with the town's coat of arms on it, and carried a staff of office, nothing fancy, just a wooden rod with metal bands. But it represented authority. He pushed through the crowd and looked at the scene. The pig, still squealing and fighting the rope, the broken door, the blood. He asked a few quick questions. Whose pig? What happened? Who saw it? Then he made his decision. This animal is to be held for trial, he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. By the authority vested in me by Lord Henri de Montfort, magistrate of Falaise, I hereby place this animal under arrest for the crime of murder. It will be imprisoned and tried according to the laws of God and the Duchy of Normandy." There was muttering in the crowd. Some people thought he was mad. Some thought it was proper good, even. Justice had to be done, they said, and that meant a trial. A few people crossed themselves and muttered prayers. Everyone had an opinion. The pig's owner, Guillaume d'Aubigny, a farmer from just outside town, he looked like he wanted to die. He kept saying it was an accident, that he didn't know how the pig had gotten into town, that he'd had her tethered in his yard. Someone must have untied her, or maybe she'd broken the rope. He was babbling, near tears. Poor bastard. His pig had just killed a child, and now he was going to lose the pig, and probably everything he owned to pay for it. They took the pig to the town jail, actually put her in a cell. There was an old storage room beneath the courthouse that they sometimes used for holding prisoners before trial, and they put her in there. Fed her, even. Kept her alive. Because you can't execute a prisoner without a trial first. That's the law. Doesn't matter if the prisoner has 4 legs. Over the next few days, the whole town talked about nothing else. In the tavern, in the market, in the church, everyone had heard about it. Some thought it was right and proper. Others thought it was absurd. But everyone was fascinated. A pig on trial. When had such a thing ever happened? Except it had happened. It turned out this wasn't uncommon at all. One of the aldermen in town, a retired clerk who'd worked in various courts, he told us he'd seen 3 animal trials in his lifetime. 2 pigs and a bull. All found guilty, all executed. There were laws for this, he said. Old laws, going back centuries. If an animal killed a human, it had to be tried and punished, just like a human murderer. So the legal machinery ground into motion. A trial date was set. 3 weeks away, they needed time to prepare, to summon witnesses, to give Guillaume time to arrange a defense if he could afford one. The magistrate, Lord Henri de Montfort, would preside. A jury would be assembled. The whole thing would be done properly, according to law. And I couldn't leave. My company was supposed to march out after a week, but I made excuses. Told my captain I was still recovering from my hangover, then said I'd twisted my bad leg and needed to rest it. Truth was, I had to see how this ended. I had to see a pig on trial. Three weeks later, I found myself in the town courthouse. It wasn't curiosity that brought me there. Well, not just curiosity. I'd told so many people about it by then that I felt obligated to see it through. Several of my fellow soldiers had stayed as well, partly to watch the spectacle, partly because we'd all placed bets on the outcome. We were idiots, betting on a pig trial, but that's soldiers for you. The courtroom was a stone chamber on the ground floor of the town hall. Cold place, damp, with narrow windows high up on the walls that let in thin shafts of autumn light. The walls were bare stone, no decoration except for a wooden crucifix on the wall behind the judge's bench. There were wooden benches for spectators. Packed full, must have been 60-70 people crammed in there. More people waiting outside, unable to get in. It was the biggest event in Falaise in years. At one end of the room was a raised platform where the judge sat, Lord Henri de Montfort, the local magistrate. He was maybe 50 years old, heavy-set, with a thick beard going grey. Wore red robes, not bright red, more like dark crimson, the colour of old blood with fur trim around the collar and sleeves. Fox fur, I think. He had a gold chain of office around his neck, and rings on every finger. The kind of man who took himself very seriously, you could tell just by looking at him. Sat up there like he was presiding over a treason trial instead of the trial of a pig. Below him, arranged on a bench to his left, sat the jury. 12 men, all citizens of Falaise. I recognized a few faces from around town. There was a baker, a candle maker, a man who sold leather goods in the market, farmers, craftsmen, respectable men. They looked uncomfortable as hell, kept shifting in their seats, glancing at each other, at the crowd, at the judge. You could tell most of them thought this was insane, but didn't dare say so. And in the center of the room, in a wooden pen about 6 feet square, was the pig. I'll never forget that sight. This big sow, muddy and confused, rooting around in the straw they'd put down for her, snout to the ground, completely unaware that she was on trial for her life. Occasionally she'd look up at the crowd with those small pig eyes, and I swear she looked baffled, like she was thinking, why are all these humans staring at me? Where's my food? She had no comprehension of what was happening. How could she? To her right stood Guillaume d'Aubigny, the owner. Poor Guillaume looked like he'd aged 10 years in 3 weeks. Thin, pale, shaking. He couldn't afford a proper lawyer, so he'd have to defend the pig himself. How do you defend a pig? What do you even say? To the left stood the prosecutor, a thin man named Jacques de Mortaine, younger than the judge, maybe 35. He had a pointed black beard, sharp features, and wore black robes. Looked like a raven. He had a stack of documents in front of him, parchment scrolls tied with ribbon, and he kept glancing at them with this expression of grim satisfaction. You could tell he thought this was important, that he was doing God's work. The clerk stood a nervous little man with ink stains on his fingers and read the charges in a nasally voice that echoed off the stone walls. By order of Lord Henri de Montfort, Magistrate of Falaise, acting in the name of His Grace the Duke of Normandy and under the laws of God Almighty, the accused one sow, being the property of Guillaume d'Aubigny, peasant of the parish of Saint-Michel, stands charged with the crime of murder most foul, to wit, that on the morning of the 23rd day of September, in the year of our Lord 1386, the said sow did wilfully and maliciously enter the dwelling house of Jean and Marie Cormier, and did there attack and kill their son, Jehan Cormier, a child of 3 years. This act being contrary to the laws of God as written in the Holy Scripture, and contrary to the laws of man as established by custom and authority, the said sow must answer for her crime. How does the accused plead? There was a moment of absolute absurdity. where everyone looked at the pig, as if expecting her to answer. The pig just grunted and kept rooting in the straw. Someone in the crowd laughed, couldn't help it, but was immediately shushed by his neighbors. This was a solemn occasion. After all, murder was serious business. Guillaume stammered something about the pig being innocent, that it was an animal, that it didn't understand, that it was acting on instinct. His voice was shaking. He was a farmer, not a lawyer. Didn't know the proper legal words. But the prosecutor cut him off. Jacques de Mortagne stood up, and when he spoke, his voice was strong and clear and full of righteous certainty. My lord, the defense would have us believe that this creature bears no responsibility for its actions, that it is, in the words of the defendant's owner, merely an animal. But I submit to this court that the law makes no such distinction. Listen to the words of Holy Scripture from the book of Exodus, chapter 21, verse 28. He read from a parchment, "If an ox gore a man or woman that they die, then the ox shall surely be stoned, and his flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall be quit." Thus speaks the word of God. The law is clear. An animal that kills must itself be killed. This is not cruelty, this is justice. This is divine law handed down from Moses himself. He went on for a while, citing other cases, other precedents. Apparently there had been a similar trial in Paris 20 years ago, another in Burgundy. Animals had been executed before. There was legal foundation for this. Guillaume tried to argue. Said the pig didn't mean to do it. Said it was hungry, probably smelled milk or food in the house. And children. Well, children are small and make noises that might sound like prey to an animal. He didn't say it well, kept stumbling over his words, but you could see he was trying. The prosecutor shot back, "Intent is irrelevant. The act was done. The child is dead. The law demands satisfaction." The jury didn't even leave the room. Lord Henri told them to confer, and they huddled together right there on their bench, whispering among themselves. I watched them. Most seemed resigned. What else could they say? The pig had killed a child. There were witnesses. The evidence was clear. Animal or not, something had to be done. 10 minutes later, maybe less, the foreman stood. He was the candle maker, I remember, because he had wax stains on his sleeve. He looked miserable. "We find the accused guilty, my lord. Guilty of murder." The judge nodded like he'd expected nothing else. He pronounced sentence in a voice that echoed through the chamber. "The prisoner is found guilty of murder and is hereby sentenced to death by hanging. The sentence will be carried out in 3 days' time in the public square, so that all may witness justice being done. Furthermore, the owner, Guillaume d'Aubigny, is required to pay the costs of imprisonment, trial, and execution. The court is adjourned." Guillaume's face went white. The costs alone would ruin him. The pig was dead, which meant he'd lost his investment and his food for winter. And now he had to pay for the privilege of having his pig executed. He swayed on his feet like he might faint. The pig just kept grunting, oblivious. The execution was set for 3 days later. Public, of course. Everything was public back then. Justice had to be seen to be done. If you punished someone in secret, people might think you hadn't punished them at all. Or worse, they might think you were being corrupt, taking bribes to let the guilty go free. So executions were spectacles. Public entertainment, in a grim sort of way. I almost didn't go. I'd seen enough death in my life, men dying of wounds, of disease, of starvation. I'd killed men myself, in battle and once in a tavern brawl that got out of hand. I didn't need to see a pig hang. But something pulled me there. Maybe morbid curiosity, maybe just the strangeness of it all. Or maybe I wanted to see how the story ended. Soldiers are superstitious about unfinished stories. Half the town turned out, more than half. People came in from the surrounding villages, from farms and hamlets miles away. Word had spread. Everyone wanted to see it. It was like a market day. Vendors had set up stalls in the square selling pies and sausages and ale. Someone had brought a cart full of apples. There were children running around, playing, laughing, women gossiping, men drinking. Someone was playing a fiddle near the fountain. A wooden scaffold had been built in the center of the square, not far from the church. Just a simple platform with a crossbeam and a noose dangling from it. The same scaffold they used for human executions. Why build a new one for a pig? The executioner was there already, a big man from Rouen who'd been hired specially for the job. The local executioner had apparently refused, said it was beneath him to hang a pig. So they'd brought in this fellow from the city. He wore a black hood with holes cut for the eyes, traditional executioner's garb. Must have been sweltering under that thing, even in October. I found a spot near the fountain where I could see reasonably well. Stood there with a few of my fellow soldiers, all of us drinking ale and waiting. It felt wrong, somehow, to be drinking and laughing at an execution, even of a pig. But that's what everyone else was doing. Human nature, I suppose. We turn everything into entertainment. Then a church bell rang, and the crowd started to quiet. They brought the pig out, and the crowd noise swelled. And this is the part that still haunts me, 40 years later. They'd dressed her. They'd actually dressed the pig in human clothing. She wore a waistcoat, I think it was green, or maybe brown. Colors are hard to remember now, buttoned up the front. Breeches on her hind legs, though how they got those on I'll never know. The pig must have fought them something fierce. There were gloves on her front trotters, white gloves like a gentleman would wear. And over her head they'd put a mask, a human face made of cloth and painted wood, with holes cut for the eyes and snout. It had a neutral expression, neither happy nor sad, just blank. It was grotesque. It was absurd. It was one of the strangest things I've ever seen, and I've seen some strange things. Here was this pig, dressed like a person, being led to execution like a person, and she was fighting every step, squealing and thrashing, trying to bite the men holding the ropes. She knew something was wrong, even if she didn't understand what. They had 4 men on her, 1 on each leg essentially, pulling and pushing to get her up onto the scaffold. Pigs are strong, and this was a big sow. It took them 10 minutes just to get her up there. The crowd watched in fascination. Some people were laughing. Some looked disturbed. Children were asking their parents questions. Why is the pig wearing clothes? Is that a person or a pig? One little girl was crying, saying it wasn't fair. Finally, they got her positioned under the noose. The executioner, I heard later, the town had paid him 10 sous and 10 deniers, the same as for a human execution. Plus, they'd bought him a new pair of gloves because he said hanging a pig would ruin his regular ones. The executioner slipped the noose over her head, over the mask. The pig thrashed harder, squealing so loud it echoed off the buildings around the square. I won't describe the hanging itself in detail. It's not something you need to hear. It was quick, at least. The executioner knew his job. The trapdoor dropped, the rope went taut, and the pig squealing cut off instantly. She kicked for a bit, not long, maybe 30 seconds, and then went still, just a body swinging slowly from the rope, dressed in human clothes, a grotesque puppet. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some people nodded in satisfaction justice had been done. Some crossed themselves and muttered prayers. Others just looked disturbed, like they'd witnessed something unnatural. The children who'd been laughing earlier had stopped. A few were crying. Parents were leading them away, back to their normal lives. I stood there for a long time after most people had drifted away. Just stood there looking at that pig swinging in the wind, wearing her little waistcoat and mask. Thinking about how I'd seen men die in battle, good men, brave men, men with families who loved them, and they died in mud and blood and been buried in mass graves without ceremony. But this pig got a trial, got dressed up, got hanged properly in front of the whole town. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Still don't, really. You think that's the end of the story? Friend, that was just the beginning of what I learned about medieval justice and animals. The secular courts, the king's courts, the town courts, they handled animals that directly attacked people. Pigs, dogs, bulls, horses. If an animal drew human blood, the law treated it like a murderer. But then I learned about the church courts, and those were even stranger. I didn't learn about the church courts until years later, after I'd settled here and started running this tavern. It was a traveling monk who told me, Brother Ambrose, his name was. Franciscan friar, odd fellow but well educated. He'd studied in Paris, travelled all over France and Italy, seen things most people never hear about. He stayed here for a week one winter, waiting out a snowstorm. Paid for his room by helping me with the accounts he could read and write and cipher, which I couldn't do well back then, and in the evenings we'd sit by the fire and talk. He told me stories that made the pig trial seem almost normal. Stories about rats being summoned to court, about weevils being excommunicated from the church, about entire swarms of locusts being served with legal papers as if they could read, about beetles, caterpillars, even leeches in a pond being put on trial. I thought he was pulling my leg at first, playing the naive tavern keeper for a fool, but he showed me documents. He carried copies of church records in his travel bag. He was doing research, he said, writing something about medieval legal practices. He unrolled these parchments and let me look at them. I couldn't read much, but I could make out enough. Official records from bishops' courts, real documents. It was all real, every word. You see, in the Middle Ages, we didn't have just one legal system. We had two, and they overlapped in complicated ways. There were the secular courts, the courts I'd seen in Falaise, dealing with crimes between people and handling animals that attacked people directly. Kings and lords ran those courts. But then there were the ecclesiastical courts, the church courts. And the church claimed jurisdiction over everything spiritual, which turned out to include a lot more than you'd think. Marriage, heresy, blasphemy, any sin that didn't involve violence, and pests, agricultural pests specifically. Rats, mice, locusts, caterpillars, weevils, any creature that destroyed crops or harmed Christian livelihoods without shedding blood. The reasoning, as Brother Ambrose explained it, was that these pests were either sent by God as punishment for sin, or sent by the devil to torment the faithful. Either way, they fell under church authority. And if they were under church authority, they could be subject to church law, which meant they could be tried, and if found guilty, could be sentenced to various punishments, including excommunication, being cast out of the church, denied the sacraments, your soul condemned to hell. And yes, they did this to insects. I know how it sounds, I know, but I saw the documents. I heard the stories, not just from Brother Ambrose, but from others who'd witnessed such things. This was real. This happened. The story Brother Ambrose told me in the most detail took place in 1510 in the Burgundy region of France, town called Autun. Beautiful country. Rolling hills covered in wheat and barley, vineyards on the slopes, forests full of game, rich farmland, or at least it used to be rich. That year, the rats came. Now, there are always rats in the countryside, of course. They live in the fields, in the barns, eat some of the grain. Farmers expect to lose a certain amount to vermin. But this wasn't normal. This was an invasion. Thousands upon thousands of rats. Maybe tens of thousands, who could count them all. They swarmed through the fields like a grey carpet, eating everything in their path. Wheat, barley, oats, all the grains, vegetable gardens, stripped bare. They even ate the bark off young fruit trees, killing the trees. By autumn, The harvest was ruined, completely ruined. Granaries that should have been full stood empty. People were starting to hoard what little food they had. There was talk of famine come winter. The farmers tried everything. They set traps, thousands of traps, caught hundreds of rats, but thousands more kept coming. They brought in cats, but there weren't enough cats in all of Burgundy to handle this many rats. They tried poison, but that was expensive and not very effective. You'd poison a few dozen rats, and the rest would learn to avoid the bait. They prayed to Saint Gertrude of Nivelles, the patron saint of protection against rats and mice, held masses, lit candles, made offerings. The rats kept coming. So finally, in desperation, they did what any sensible medieval peasant would do. They sued the rats, took them to court. Not the secular court. What would the Duke of Burgundy care about rats eating peasant grain? No. They went to the ecclesiastical court, the bishop's court of Autun, filed a formal complaint against all rats currently residing within the diocese of Autun for destruction of property and threatening the Christian community with starvation. The bishop, I forget his name, Brother Ambrose told me, but I didn't write it down. The bishop took the case. Of course he did. The church courts had clear jurisdiction over agricultural pests. There were precedents going back a century or more. So, in the winter of 1510, the rats of Autun were officially summoned to appear in ecclesiastical court to answer charges. Now, here's where it gets truly absurd. The rats, naturally, didn't show up for their court date. I mean, they're rats. They don't read summonses. They don't understand legal proceedings. They're busy eating grain and making more rats. So the court did what it would do if human defendants failed to appear. It appointed them a lawyer, a defense attorney, for the rats. His name was Bartholomew Chassenet, and from what Brother Ambrose told me, he was quite brilliant. He'd been practicing law for years, had defended animals before pigs, I think, and maybe a donkey and a mule. He knew canon law inside and out, knew all the procedures and precedents, and he took the case seriously, genuinely argued on behalf of the rats with all the skill and dedication he'd give a human client. The court convened. The prosecutor laid out the case. The rats had destroyed the harvest, threatened the community with starvation, caused economic ruin to hundreds of families. The evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses testified to seeing the rats, to the extent of the damage. Farmers brought in ruined grain, gnawed vegetables, gnawed bark. The rats were clearly guilty. But then Chassenet stood to present his defense, and he made an argument that, well, it was ridiculous, but also somehow legally brilliant. He argued that the summons had been improperly served. According to church law, all defendants must be personally notified of their trial. The court had posted the summons on church doors throughout the diocese and had the local priests announce it from the pulpit. But how could the court be certain that every rat in the diocese had been notified? Had anyone gone to the fields, the barns, the cellars, the walls of every house, and personally informed each individual rat? No? then how could the rats be held in contempt of court for failing to appear? Under church law, you cannot punish a defendant who was not properly notified. The judges, there were 3 of them, all senior church officials, they actually considered this argument, debated it amongst themselves, finally decided that Chassanet had a point. So they ordered that the summons be served again, more thoroughly this time. Court officers went out to every parish in the diocese and read the summons aloud in Latin in every church, every barn, every public building. They posted notices on trees in the forests. They even, and I'm not making this up, sent priests into the fields to read the summons aloud to the rats directly. The rats still didn't appear. So a new court date was set, and once again the rats failed to show. The prosecutor demanded they be found in contempt and sentenced in absentia. But Chassanet wasn't done. He filed a motion arguing that his clients couldn't reasonably be expected to travel to the courthouse because the journey was too dangerous. What danger? The court asked. They're rats. What do rats have to fear? Cats, Chassanet said. The roads between the fields where the rats lived and the courthouse in Orton were filled with cats, natural predators of rats. How could the court expect his clients to risk their lives just to attend a legal hearing? It was unreasonable. It violated their right to safe passage. He demanded that the plaintiffs, the farmers, provide written guarantees of safe conduct for all rat defendants, ensuring that no cat would harm them on their journey to court. The court actually spent days debating this. Days? How could you guarantee safe passage for rats from cats? Could you round up all the cats in the diocese? Could you post guards along the roads? Was it even possible? The farmers certainly couldn't do it. The whole thing was impossible. And that, essentially, was Chassanet's point. You cannot punish defendants for failing to appear if it's impossible for them to appear safely. The law must be reasonable. If the law makes impossible demands, it ceases to be just. The case dragged on for months. Court sessions, motions, counter-motions, legal arguments that went in circles. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, the rats kept eating what little grain was left. Winter came. People started to go hungry. The case became something of a joke in the region even as people were starving. They'd laugh bitterly about the rats' lawyers. Eventually, and Brother Ambrose wasn't entirely clear on this part, the records were incomplete. Eventually, the case was either dismissed or settled somehow. One version said the rats left on their own as winter set in, moving to better feeding grounds. Another version said the court eventually passed sentence but couldn't figure out how to enforce it against thousands of rats scattered across the countryside. Either way, the trial ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. But the point is, it happened. A real trial, with real judges and real lawyers, arguing for weeks about whether rats could be held in contempt of court and whether cats posed an unreasonable danger to rat defendants. Serious men in robes, citing legal precedents, debating the rights of rodents, and everyone involved, the judges, the lawyers, the farmers, the priests, they all treated it as legitimate, as real law. But the church courts didn't always bother with trials. Sometimes they went straight to sentencing. And their favorite punishment for pests wasn't execution. How do you execute a swarm of locusts anyway? No, their favorite punishment was excommunication. Think about that for a moment. Excommunication, being formally cast out of the church, denied the sacraments, your soul condemned to eternal damnation. The most severe spiritual punishment the church could levy. And they did this to insects, to worms, to beetles and moths and mice. Brother Ambrose told me about one case. This was in Switzerland, he thought, or maybe northern Italy, somewhere in the Alps. A village whose vineyards were being destroyed by caterpillars. Green ones, fat as your thumb, appearing in the thousands just as the grapevines were leafing out in spring. They'd strip the leaves off faster than the plants could grow them. No leaves meant no grapes. No grapes meant no wine. And no wine meant economic ruin. Wine was their livelihood. See, everything depended on those vineyards. The villagers tried everything they could think of. They picked the caterpillars off by hand, one by one, dropping them in buckets of water to drown them. Took all day, and the next morning there'd be thousands more. They tried burning them off with torches, but that just damaged the vines. They sprayed the vines with holy water blessed by the priest, thinking maybe the caterpillars were demon spawn. Didn't work. They prayed to Saint Magnus. Yes, that's a real saint, patron saint, of protection against caterpillars. There's a saint for everything, apparently. They held a special mass, made offerings, lit candles. The caterpillars kept coming. So finally, the village priest decided to take direct action. He consulted with his bishop, got permission, and announced that he would perform a rite of excommunication upon the caterpillars. The whole village was to participate. On the appointed day, it was a Sunday. After regular morning mass, the entire village processed from the church down to the vineyards. Everyone was there. Men, women, children, even the old folks who could barely walk. The priest led the way in his full vestments, carrying a crucifix and a bowl of holy water. Behind him came altar boys swinging censers, filling the air with incense smoke. Then the villagers, many of them carrying candles or religious icons. They gathered among the grapevines, surrounded by thousands upon thousands of these fat green caterpillars munching away, completely oblivious. The priest set up a small altar, just a wooden table, really, and laid out his holy book and implements. Then he began the ceremony. He prayed. He read from Scripture. He called upon God, the Virgin Mary, all the saints, to witness what he was about to do. And then, with the whole village watching, with incense smoke drifting through the vineyard, and the sound of Latin chanting echoing off the mountains, he pronounced the sentence of excommunication. By the authority of God the Father Almighty, Creator of heaven and earth, and by the authority of the blessed apostles Peter and Paul, and by our own authority as priest of this parish, we do hereby separate you, all caterpillars present in this vineyard, from the precious body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ. We exclude you from the fellowship of all Christians. We cast you out from the holy church, and we judge you damned, with the devil and his fallen angels, and all the reprobate, to eternal fire and everlasting punishment. The priest sprinkled holy water over the vines, over the caterpillars. He made the sign of the cross in all 4 directions. The villagers responded with, "Amen," after each pronouncement, their voices rising together. "You are excommunicate. You have no place in God's kingdom. You are condemned. Depart from this place. Return to the pit from whence you came." And then it was done. The priest packed up his implements, the procession filed back to the village, and everyone went home to wait and see if it worked. Here's the strange thing: Brother Ambrose showed me records of this case, and dozens like it in many instances. The pests actually left afterward, sometimes immediately, sometimes within a few days. The caterpillars would disappear. The locusts would swarm elsewhere. The weevils would vacate the granaries. Now, obviously, there were natural explanations. Caterpillars have life cycles, they pupate and turn into moths and fly away. Locusts move on when they've exhausted the food supply. Seasonal changes drive pests away. Pure coincidence, most likely, but the villagers didn't see it that way. They saw cause and effect. The priest excommunicated the pests, and the pests left. Proof that it worked. Proof that the church had power over these creatures. And maybe, in a way, it did work. Not because God actually cared whether caterpillars could take communion, but because it gave the villagers something to do. Some sense of control in a world where so much was beyond their power. When your crops are being destroyed and you've tried everything practical and nothing works, what else can you do but turn to the spiritual? At least then you feel like you're doing something, like you're not completely helpless. Now, you're probably thinking these judges and priests were all fools, religious fanatics who'd lost their minds, and maybe some of them were. But here's the thing that haunted me after Brother Ambrose told me all these stories. The thing that kept me up at night thinking. Sometimes the animals were acquitted, sometimes they were shown mercy, and those cases revealed something about what these trials really meant. Something deeper than just superstition or medieval madness. This next story came to me through a traveling merchant years after the Falaise execution. French fellow from the Savoy region, up near the mountains where France meets Switzerland and Italy. His name was Michel. Made his living trading wine and cheese between villages. He'd been present at another pig trial, he said, and this one had ended differently. The year was 1457. The place was a village whose name I can never pronounce properly, something like Lavigny or Savigny, one of those. Another tragedy, another sow, another dead child. A 5-year-old boy this time. The details don't matter now. Every one of these stories is the same in the essentials. A mother steps away for a moment. A pig gets in. A child is lost. A family is destroyed. The details are just variations on the same terrible theme. But this time there was a complication. The sow had 6 piglets with her, young ones, maybe 2 months old, still nursing. And when they found the sow in the house, When they saw what had happened, the piglets were there too, small pink bodies running around, squealing, and some of them had blood on their snouts. Just smears, probably from nuzzling their mother, but blood nonetheless. So the village bailiff, following the law as he understood it, arrested all of them, the mother and all 6 babies, put them in a pen together to await trial, fed them, kept them alive. You can't execute a prisoner without trial. After all, that's the law. The trial happened a few weeks later. Michel was there because he'd been in the village on business and, like me and Falaise, he couldn't bring himself to leave before seeing how it ended. Human curiosity. Or maybe human sickness sometimes. I'm not sure there's a difference. The trial for the mother So went exactly as you'd expect. Witnesses testified. Evidence was presented. The prosecutor cited scripture and precedent. Guilty of murder. Sentenced to death. No surprises there. But then the prosecutor stood up and said he wanted the piglets tried as well, as accomplices to murder. So the village bailiff, following the law as he understood it, arrested all of them, the mother and all 6 babies, put them in a pen together to await trial, fed them, kept them alive. You can't execute a prisoner without trial. After all, that's the law. The trial happened a few weeks later. Michel was there because he'd been in the village on business and, like me and Falaise, he couldn't bring himself to leave before seeing how it ended. Human curiosity, or maybe human sickness sometimes. I'm not sure there's a difference. The trial for the mother So went exactly as you'd expect. Witnesses testified. Evidence was presented. The prosecutor cited scripture and precedent. Guilty of murder. Sentenced to death. No surprises there. But then the prosecutor stood up and said he wanted the piglets tried as well, as accomplices to murder. My lord, he said, these piglets were present at the scene of the crime. They bear the marks of guilt upon them, blood on their snouts, blood on their trotters. How do we know they didn't participate in the attack? How do we know they won't grow up to be killers like their mother? Better to destroy them now, while they're young, than to wait for them to claim another victim. It was a chilling argument, and legally, if animals could be held responsible for their actions, why would age matter? A killer is a killer, even a young one, even a pig barely 2 months old. But here's where something extraordinary happened. The farmer who owned the pigs, his name was Pierre, I think. Michel wasn't certain this farmer, who was already ruined financially, who was already going to lose his breeding sow and face court costs that would beggar him, he somehow scraped together enough money to hire a lawyer. Not for the mother, she was clearly guilty, nothing to be done there. But for the piglets, he hired a lawyer to defend 6 baby pigs. My lord, he said, these piglets were present at the scene of the crime. They bear the marks of guilt upon them, blood on their snouts, blood on their trotters. How do we know they didn't participate in the attack? How do we know they won't grow up to be killers like their mother? Better to destroy them now, while they're young, than to wait for them to claim another victim. It was a chilling argument, and legally, if animals could be held responsible for their actions, why would age matter? A killer is a killer, even a young one, even a pig barely 2 months old. But here's where something extraordinary happened. The farmer who owned the pigs, his name was Pierre, I think. Michel wasn't certain. This farmer, who was already ruined financially, who was already going to lose his breeding sow and face court costs that would beggar him, he somehow scraped together enough money to hire a lawyer. Not for the mother, she was clearly guilty, nothing to be done there. But for the piglets, he hired a lawyer to defend 6 baby pigs. The court debated this, not for minutes, for hours. Michel said the trial, which had started in the morning, went all day. The judges consulted with each other, consulted with a church scholar who was present, consulted old legal texts. They discussed whether animals could have intent, whether youth was a mitigating factor in animal crimes, whether piglets could be said to have free will or were merely following instinct and maternal bonds. It sounds insane, doesn't it? Grown men, educated men, spending hours debating the moral responsibility of piglets. But they did it. They took it seriously. Because if the law applied to animals and they believed it did, then the law had to be applied correctly, fairly, even for pigs. Finally, as the sun was setting, the chief judge rendered his verdict. After careful consideration, he said, this court finds that the 6 piglets cannot be held responsible for the crime of their mother. They lack the age, the understanding, and the malicious intent necessary for guilt. Therefore, they are acquitted of all charges and released into the custody of their owner, with the stipulation that he keep them under strict supervision and not allow them to roam freely. The farmer wept. Michel said the man actually fell to his knees and wept with relief. His sow was condemned, yes, but he'd saved the piglets. 6 animals that would grow and breed and eventually restore his livelihood. He wasn't completely ruined after all. The mother sow was hanged the next day, strung up by her back legs from a tree outside the village, different method than fillets, but same result. Michel watched it happen, said it was strange and sad seeing this pig hanging there while below, in a pen, her 6 piglets rooted around in the dirt, squealing and playing, completely unaware that their mother had just been executed. But what struck Michel, and what struck me when he told me the story, was that the court had genuinely wrestled with a moral question. They'd asked, can these creatures be held responsible? Do they have the capacity for guilt? And they'd concluded, no, the young ones don't. They're innocent. They deserve mercy. In a strange, twisted way, it was almost enlightened. They were trying to be just, trying to apply the law fairly, even to animals. The logic was bizarre. Yes, pigs don't have moral responsibility at all, young or old. But within their worldview, within their understanding of how the universe worked, they were trying to do the right thing. They believed animals had souls. They believed animals were part of God's creation, subject to His laws. And if that was true, then animals deserved something like rights, like fair treatment, like mercy when mercy was warranted. I've thought about that a lot over the years. How we mock medieval people for their superstitions, their strange beliefs. But in this case, their strange belief led them to show mercy to 6 baby pigs who would otherwise have been killed. Is that worse than our modern view, where we see animals as things, as property without souls or rights? I'm not sure anymore. You want to know something that's not funny at all? Actually tragic? These animal trials, these elaborate ceremonies of justice and law, they were expensive, incredibly expensive. And the costs fell on the people who were already suffering, already victims of tragedy. I told you earlier that I once saw an accounting ledger from the Falaise trial. Let me tell you what was in it, because it's important. It shows you what justice actually meant in those days, what it cost in real terms. Imprisonment of the sow, 10 sous per week for nearly 3 months, 12 weeks in jail, waiting for the trial to be prepared, for witnesses to be summoned, for all the legal procedures to be followed. That's 120 sous just for keeping a pig in a cell. They had to feed her, you see. Couldn't let her starve, that would be cruel. And cruelty to prisoners was frowned upon, even if the prisoner was a pig. Court fees, 20 sous. That covered the use of the courthouse, the judge's time, the administrative costs. Scribe to record the proceedings, 15 sous. Someone had to write down every word said in court, make an official record. That's the law. Bailiff to serve the summons, 5 sous. Witnesses had to be formally summoned, documents delivered, all official and proper. Then there was the trial itself, the prosecutor's fee, 30 sous. He was acting in the public interest, see, representing justice itself, but he still got paid. The jury, each member got 2 sous for their time, so 24 sous total. They were taken away from their work, their shops, their farms. They had to be compensated. And then the execution. The executioner's fee from Rouen, 10 sous and 10 deniers. That was standard rate for a human execution. Pigs paid the same price as people, apparently. The new gloves for the executioner because he refused to use his regular ones. 2 sous 6 deniers. Leather gloves. Good quality, he was particular about that. The cost of the human clothing for the pig, 8 sous. They'd hired a tailor, had to pay him for his work and materials. The rope, 1 sou. The scaffold construction, 25 sous. They'd built a new platform because the old one was rotting. Add it all up, and the total came to something like 300 sous. Maybe 350. I saw the numbers, but didn't write them down. Wish I had. Now, to put that in perspective, a common laborer in those days earned about 3 sous per week. A skilled craftsman, maybe 5 or 6. An average farmer might make 200 sous in a good year, after expenses. This trial cost more than most people earned in a year, maybe 2 years. And who paid? Guillaume. Poor Guillaume d'Aubigny, whose pig had killed a child. He'd already lost the child's parents' friendship, probably their forgiveness. He'd lost his pig, his investment, his food for winter, his breeding stock, and then the court sent him a bill for 300 sous. He couldn't pay it, of course. Nobody could. So they took his farm, seized his property, sold it to pay the debt. He ended up working as a day laborer for other farmers. The lowest work there is. One tragedy, a pig getting loose, an accident destroyed his entire life. Not just once, but twice. First the guilt of what his animal had done, then the financial ruin. And this wasn't unusual. This was normal. Every animal trial worked this way. The owner paid. If they couldn't pay in coin, they paid in property, in land, in livestock, in whatever they had. The law got its due, one way or another. Justice, it turns out, is expensive, and in medieval times, the victims paid for it. So why? Why did they do all this? Why the elaborate trials, the expensive ceremonies, the absurd legal arguments about rats and caterpillars and pigs? I've spent years thinking about that question, decades now, really, and I've come to some conclusions, though I'm not certain of any of them. Life rarely offers certainty. First, there's the simple human need for justice. When something terrible happens, a child killed, crops destroyed, plague spreading through your livestock, people need someone to blame, someone to punish. It's not enough to say it was an accident, or it was God's will, or these things happen. Our minds rebel against that. We need cause and effect. We need to see the guilty punished, to see justice done, even if the guilty party is a pig or a swarm of locusts. It's a way of imposing order on chaos, of saying, this didn't happen randomly. There was a cause, and we've addressed it. We've made it right. Now we can move on. Second, there's theology. Medieval people believed, truly, deeply believed that all creatures were part of God's creation. All creatures had a place in His divine order, a role to play in His plan, and that meant all creatures were subject to His laws. The Bible says Exodus, chapter 21, verse 28, if an ox kills a man, that ox must be stoned to death, not butchered for meat, not sold or traded, executed, killed publicly, its flesh left to rot because it has committed murder. They took that seriously. They believed it wasn't just about property damage or public safety. It was about cosmic order, about maintaining God's law in the world. An animal that killed had violated that order, had sinned, yes, sinned, and had to be punished to restore the balance. And if animals could sin, then they needed trials. They needed someone to speak for them, to defend them, to ensure that justice was done fairly, even for a pig. Especially for a pig, maybe, because a pig couldn't defend itself. My friend Alistair, I mentioned him before, the royal librarian, brilliant man, knows more about old books and old ideas than anyone I've ever met. He explained it to me once, years ago. We were sitting in this very room, actually, drinking wine late into the night, and I asked him the same question. Why did they put animals on trial? Barnaby, he said, the law is not just for the living. It's a reflection of the cosmic order, the divine plan. It's a reminder that all creatures, human and animal, great and small, powerful and weak, exist within God's justice. Nothing escapes it. Not kings in their palaces, not peasants in their fields, not even the rats in the barns. The law covers everything, because God's justice covers everything. To exempt animals from the law would be to say they're outside God's concern, and that's heresy. I think there's truth in that. These trials were rituals. They were the community coming together and saying, we live in an ordered world. The universe makes sense. There are rules, and when those rules are broken, there are consequences. Always, without exception. Even if those consequences seem absurd to us now, even if we've lost the ability to understand why they mattered. Third, and perhaps most important, there's the matter of power and control. These trials demonstrated the reach of authority. They showed that the law's power extended over everything, not just humans, but the natural world itself. Not just the living, but creation in all its forms. When a judge could put a pig on trial, dress it in human clothes, and hang it in the town square with full legal ceremony that sent a message, it said, the law is absolute. Nothing is beyond its grasp. The court's authority covers everything that happens within its jurisdiction. It was a show of power, a demonstration that the judges, the magistrates, the church officials they controlled, not just human behavior, but the entire world. Even the animals obeyed their decrees or faced the consequences. And maybe, in a world of chaos and violence and plague and famine and sudden death, maybe people needed that message. Maybe they needed to believe that someone, somewhere, was in control. That there was order, even when everything felt like chaos. That justice existed, even when life seemed random and cruel. The animal trials gave them that. They said, look, even this terrible accident, even this random tragedy, even this pig killing a child, it's not outside the law. It's not beyond justice. We can address it. We can fix it. We can make the world right again. Even if it was an illusion. Even if the world stayed just as chaotic and cruel afterward. At least for a moment, during the trial, during the execution, they felt like the universe made sense. The last recorded animal trial in Europe, I think it was sometime in the late 1700s, could have been early 1800s, somewhere in rural France, probably, or maybe Germany. The records get fuzzy toward the end. By then, the Enlightenment was in full swing. Reason, science, progress, all those modern ideas, spreading from the cities to the countryside. People started to laugh at the old ways, mock them. Look at those superstitious medievals, they said, putting pigs on trial, excommunicating caterpillars, serving lawsuits on rats. How foolish they were, how ignorant, how backward. And maybe they were foolish, maybe they were ignorant. Maybe we all are, in our own ways, seeing patterns where there are none, imposing meaning on random chance, trying to control things that can't be controlled. The trials stopped, the laws changed, Animals were redefined not as creatures with souls and moral responsibility, but as property, resources, things without consciousness or moral weight. You don't put property on trial. You just destroy it when it causes damage, the way you'd destroy a broken tool or a rotten building. I'm not sure that's progress, but there it is. But you know what? Sometimes I think maybe we haven't changed as much as we'd like to believe. We don't put pigs in courtrooms anymore. No. We don't dress them in waistcoats and hang them in the square. We don't excommunicate locusts or put rats on trial. Those days are gone, and probably good riddance. But when a dog bites a child, what do? We put it down. We destroy dangerous animals. We trap rats, poison insects, hunt wolves and bears, and anything that threatens us to extinction. We still need something to blame, something to punish. We still need to believe that when something bad happens, we can make it right by taking action, by eliminating the threat. The form is different, but the need is the same. We're still struggling with the same questions those medieval judges struggled with, the same questions humans have always struggled with. What is justice? Who deserves mercy? How do we live in a world where terrible things happen to innocent people for no reason at all? Where children die and crops fail and disasters strike without warning or explanation? And we still don't have good answers. We have different answers than they did. Modern answers, scientific answers. But are they better? Are they truer? Or are they just different ways of coping with the same fundamental uncertainty? Maybe there are no good answers. Maybe there never were. Maybe the best we can do is what those medieval people did. Create rituals that make us feel better. Tell ourselves stories about order and justice and meaning. Pretend we understand why things happen the way they do. Find something to blame, something to punish, something to give us the illusion of control. And maybe that's all right. Maybe that's all we've ever been able to do. The fire's burning low now, friend. Just embers left. The storm outside has calmed. Listen, just a soft rain now. The kind that helps things grow. Peaceful. I hope these old tales didn't trouble your sleep too much. Medieval justice was strange. Absurd, even. But it reminds us that humans have always struggled, always questioned, always tried to make sense of the senseless, to find meaning in chaos, to impose order on a world that resists all our attempts to understand it. We're not so different from them, really. We just use different words, different rituals. We tell ourselves we're wiser now, more enlightened. And maybe we are, in some ways. But we're still human, still afraid, still searching for answers that probably don't exist. Still putting things on trial, different things, in different ways, but still looking for someone or something to blame when the world doesn't make sense. Rest now. The night's nearly over. Morning will come soon enough. And when it does, you'll wake in a world where pigs no longer stand trial, where rats aren't summoned to court, where caterpillars can't be excommunicated. You'll wake in a modern world, a rational world, a world of science and reason. And You can decide for yourself whether we've truly become wiser or just different.